Hello. I met Sarah 12 years ago at a mutual friend's wedding. It was one of those late spring ceremonies where everything felt warm and full of promise. She was standing near the bar, laughing at some joke I hadn't heard, and I remember thinking that I had to know what was so funny. Sarah had this way of making a room feel brighter, not because she was the loudest or the most extravagant, but because people were naturally drawn to her. I worked up the nerve to introduce myself, and from that moment, everything clicked. Our conversation stretched through the night, effortless and easy, as if we had already known each other in another life. She had an adventurous spirit, always looking for the next challenge, while I was more grounded, focused on stability and long-term goals. It was a contrast that worked. She made life exciting, and I made sure we never lost our way. We started dating soon after, and within a year, I knew I wanted to marry her. She was ambitious, independent, and sharp-witted, someone who never backed down from an argument but also knew how to laugh at herself. She had this way of making even the most ordinary moments feel special. A random Tuesday night cooking dinner could turn into an impromptu dance party in the kitchen. A lazy Sunday on the couch became a debate over which decade had the best music, complete with hours of old songs playing in the background. When I proposed, it wasn't anything extravagant, just the two of us at our favorite spot by the lake, the place we always went when we needed to talk or just sit in silence together. She said yes before I could even finish asking, practically knocking me over in excitement. We built a life together, moving into our first apartment, then buying a house a few years later. We talked about kids, though we never made a firm decision. We were happy, enjoying the freedom of our lives while still knowing we had each other. Now, nearly a decade into our marriage, we had settled into a comfortable routine. Sarah worked in marketing, always juggling projects, networking, and attending events. I worked in finance, a steady 9-to-5 job that allowed me to keep our future secure. We had our hobbies. She loved yoga and traveling. I was more into home improvement and weekend hikes. Our social life was full but not overwhelming. We had friends over for dinner, took weekend trips when we could, and made time for date nights even when work got busy. To anyone looking from the outside, we were the perfect couple. And for a long time, I believed that too. Married life with Sarah was everything I had hoped for. We had spent nearly a decade together, building a foundation of love, trust, and shared experiences. Our house was a modest but beautiful 2-story home in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where neighbors waved as they walked their dogs, where summer barbecues turned into late-night conversations around a fire pit. It wasn't a mansion, but it was ours, a place filled with memories, inside jokes, and the quiet understanding that we were in this for the long haul. Sarah was the kind of person who thrived on structure but hated feeling tied down. She planned our vacations months in advance, yet she was also the first one to suggest a spontaneous weekend road trip. She had an energy about her that made everything feel more alive. Whether it was decorating the house for the holidays or making an ordinary dinner feel like a special occasion, she had a way of turning small moments into something memorable. Our daily life was predictable but comfortable. Weekday mornings were a mix of rushed coffee, quick kisses, and last-minute reminders about errands. Sarah left earlier than I did, always in a hurry, a coffee tumbler in one hand and her phone in the other as she skimmed through emails. Evenings were spent unwinding together, sometimes watching our favorite shows, sometimes working on separate things but still sharing the same space. I loved those quiet moments, just the two of us, existing in a way that didn't need words. We had built a life filled with traditions. Friday nights were always takeout and a movie. Sunday mornings meant sleeping in and making pancakes, a habit we had kept from our earliest days of dating. We still left each other little notes, something as simple as good luck with your meeting or don't forget we're out of milk. They were small gestures, but they reminded me that no matter how busy life got, we still made the effort to connect. Of course, no marriage is perfect. We had our disagreements, small things like her tendency to leave half-full glasses of water all over the house, or my habit of letting laundry pile up before finally dealing with it. But we never let arguments linger. We knew how to navigate each other's moods, how to give space when needed, and when to push for conversation. That was the beauty of our relationship. We had figured each other out. Or so I thought. Our love wasn't grand gestures or dramatic passion. It was steady, reliable. I took pride in that. I believed in us, in the life we had built. I trusted her completely. And in those moments, I never once imagined that trust would be tested. As the years passed, Sarah and I settled into the rhythm of a well-worn partnership. We knew each other's quirks, the little habits that made up our daily lives. She always slept with one leg outside the blanket, no matter the season. I always had to triple-check that the front door was locked before bed. She needed background noise when she worked, filling the house with the hum of podcasts and music, while I preferred silence, finding comfort in the stillness. Our careers kept us busy, but we made time for each other. Sarah thrived in her marketing role, constantly bouncing between projects, client meetings, and after-work networking events. She loved the challenge, the constant motion of it all. Meanwhile, my job in finance was more predictable, steady hours, clear goals, the kind of structure that suited me. We joked that I was the anchor and she was the sail, that I kept us grounded while she made sure we never stood still for too long. We had built a life that was, in many ways, exactly what we had hoped for when we first got married. Our home was a reflection of both of us, modern yet cozy, filled with framed photos of our travels and small mementos from a life well lived. Sarah had an eye for design, and every room had a touch of her creativity. From the carefully arranged bookshelves to the soft lighting she insisted made the house feel warmer. Our social life was active but balanced. We had friends over for dinner at least once a month, sometimes hosting game nights, sometimes just sitting around with wine and long conversations. Sarah had a wider circle of acquaintances, always keeping up with old colleagues, gym friends, and people she had met through work events. I was more selective, preferring a few close friendships over a broad network. But that difference never felt like an issue. It was just another way we complemented each other. Vacations were a mix of adventure and relaxation. She loved the idea of visiting new places, and I loved seeing her excitement when she planned our next trip. We had been to Italy, Japan, and Mexico, collecting memories in the form of inside jokes and stories we told over and over again. One of our favorite trips was to a remote cabin in the mountains, where we spent a week hiking, reading by the fireplace, and watching the stars at night. It was one of the rare times when Sarah truly slowed down, and I loved seeing her in that space. Unrushed, fully present. We weren't perfect, but we were solid. We argued about the usual things, chores, spending habits, how much time we spent on our phones. But at the end of the day, I believed in us. I believed in the vows we had made. We had built something strong, something that felt unshakable, and I had no reason to think otherwise. Looking back, I can't pinpoint the exact moment when things started to feel off. It wasn't some dramatic shift, no sudden change that made me sit up and take notice. It was subtle at first, small things, the kind you dismiss because they seem too minor to matter. Sarah had always been busy with work, but lately, her schedule had become unpredictable. She started staying late at the office more often, sometimes without much warning. It wasn't unusual for her to have networking events or last-minute client meetings, but I began to notice a pattern. She was vague when I asked about her plans, brushing off details with quick responses. Just work stuff, she'd say. Or, nothing interesting, just another long day. At first, I didn't think much of it. We had always trusted each other. But then there were the little things that started to nag at me. She had always been attached to her phone, but now she guarded it more carefully. If I walked into the room while she was texting, she'd tilt the screen away, just slightly, subtle enough that I could have ignored it, but obvious enough that I noticed. She started setting it face down on the table, something she never used to do. And one night, when I reached for it to check the time, she snatched it up before I could even glance at the screen. Her excuses started feeling rehearsed. I'd ask how her day was, and she'd give me the same generic answers every time. Busy but good. Tiring but productive. There were no real details, no funny stories about her coworkers, nothing about the projects she was working on. Just a hollow summary, like she was going through the motions of our conversations without actually engaging in them. She was different at home, too. She used to be the one to initiate plans, date nights, weekend getaways, even just watching a movie together after dinner. Now, she seemed distant, distracted, always too tired or not in the mood. The easy intimacy we had shared for years had started to fade, replaced by a growing space between us that I couldn't quite close. I told myself it was just a rough patch. Every couple goes through them. Maybe work really was just that stressful. Maybe she was dealing with something she hadn't told me about. I wanted to believe that, because the alternative, that something was truly wrong, wasn't something I was ready to face. But the more I paid attention, the harder it became to ignore. One evening, I came home earlier than usual. Her car was in the driveway, But when I walked inside, the house was silent. Normally, she'd be in the living room watching TV or finishing up work at the kitchen counter. But that day, she was nowhere to be seen. I called out her name, and after a long pause, she finally answered from the bedroom. Her voice sounded off, like she had been caught off guard. When I walked in, she was sitting on the edge of the bed, phone in hand. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hey, you're home early," she said, locking her screen and setting the phone down beside her. There was nothing outwardly suspicious about it, but something about the way she looked at me, like she was trying too hard to act normal, sent a prickle of unease down my spine. I brushed it off, told myself I was overthinking, that I was just imagining things. But deep down, something had shifted. For the first time in our marriage, I had a reason to doubt her. Once the doubt crept in, it was impossible to ignore. At first, I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But the mind has a way of picking up on patterns, on small inconsistencies that don't sit right no matter how much you try to explain them away. And soon, those patterns became impossible to dismiss. Sarah's behavior continued to shift in ways that seemed minor on their own, but together, they painted a picture I didn't want to see. She was spending more time on her phone, but I never saw her actually talking to anyone. She would laugh at something while looking at the screen, but when I asked what was funny, she'd just shake her head and say, "Oh, nothing. Just a dumb work meme." Her schedule, which had always been packed but predictable, became erratic. One night, she'd come home exhausted, barely speaking before heading straight to bed. The next, she'd be energized, almost giddy, saying she had grabbed drinks with coworkers after work. When I asked which coworkers, her answers were always vague. "You don't know them," she'd say with a dismissive wave of her hand. And then there were the unexplained absences. One Saturday afternoon, she told me she was going to a yoga class and might run some errands afterward. That wasn't unusual. Sarah loved her workout routine, and she often took the chance to shop afterward. But when I checked the location of her gym app later that day, I noticed something strange. There was no record of her checking into the class. I told myself maybe the app had glitched. Maybe she had forgotten to scan in. But when she came home hours later, she was wearing the same outfit she had left in, without any of the usual post-workout exhaustion. Her gym bag, which she normally tossed near the door, was still slung over her shoulder when she kissed me on the cheek and disappeared into the bedroom. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, I stared at the ceiling, trying to push away the uneasy feeling in my gut. I wasn't a jealous husband. I had never been the type to question Sarah's loyalty, had never felt the need to check her phone or ask where she was every second of the day. We had built our marriage on trust. But trust only works when both people uphold it. And now, I wasn't sure if Sarah was. I started paying closer attention, watching for little things I would have once ignored. Her perfume lingered stronger when she came home late. There were faint marks on her skin, not bruises, but slight red marks on her neck and collarbone, the kind that could have come from something innocent, but also the kind that could come from something else. One evening, I casually mentioned that I might stop by her office to take her to lunch. It was something we used to do often, but lately, she had always been too busy. This time, her reaction was immediate, a flicker of something on her face, just for a second, before she smiled and said, "This week's crazy. Maybe next time." It felt like a test, and I had my answer. The doubt was no longer just a feeling. It was real. Sarah was hiding something. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I really wanted to know the truth. Doubt had taken root in my mind, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, it only grew stronger. Every little inconsistency, every vague excuse, every shift in Sarah's behavior fed into the feeling that something was deeply, undeniably wrong. I wanted to believe I was overthinking, that I was seeing problems where there were none. But I had never been the jealous or paranoid type. If I was feeling this way, there had to be a reason. I started paying closer attention to everything. Sarah had always been open with her phone before, leaving it on the table or couch without a second thought. Now, she kept it glued to her side, even taking it with her to the bathroom. Her notifications, which used to light up the screen freely, were now set to private. When I casually asked why, she just shrugged and said, "Work messages. I don't want to be distracted all the time." Her schedule had become more unpredictable. Some nights, she'd come home exhausted and barely say a word before heading straight to bed. Other nights, she was full of energy, like she had been drinking or riding a high of some kind. When I asked where she had been, her answers were always vague. Just catching up with some friends. Went to the gym, then grabbed a drink. The names she mentioned didn't match up with the people she used to talk about. And then there were the lies. One evening, she told me she had a late meeting at work. It wasn't unusual, so I didn't question it, until I happened to drive past her office building on my way home. The parking lot was nearly empty. No sign of Sarah's car. I went home and waited, pretending to watch TV as my mind raced. When she finally walked through the door, she smelled different. Not the usual scent of her perfume, but something heavier, almost musky. Her hair was slightly disheveled, like she had been running her hands through it. "How was the meeting?" I asked casually. She hesitated, just for a second, before smiling. "Boring as hell. You know how those things go." I nodded, playing along. But inside, something cracked. That was the moment I knew for sure. Sarah was lying to me. I needed proof. I didn't want to be the kind of person who snooped, but she had left me no choice. That night, while she was asleep, I checked her phone. I knew her passcode. She had never bothered to change it, but when I tried, I realized she had. That was all the confirmation I needed. She was hiding something. The next day, I checked her car. I wasn't sure what I was even looking for, maybe a receipt, a second phone, some kind of clue. But it was spotless, almost too clean. Sarah wasn't the type to obsess over her car's cleanliness. Yet the interior looked freshly wiped down, as if she had gone out of her way to erase any traces of what? I felt sick. For days, I tried to act normal, pretending nothing had changed. But inside, my mind was spinning. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't focus at work. I had built my entire life around this woman, and now I was starting to realize she might not be the person I thought she was. And then I made my decision. If she was cheating on me, I needed to know for sure. I needed undeniable proof. I would install cameras in the house. Not because I wanted to catch her in the act. God, I didn't want to see that. But because I needed the truth. And once I had it, I could decide what to do next. I didn't want to be a fool any longer. Once I made the decision to install cameras, there was no going back. It felt like a betrayal, sneaking around in my own home, setting up hidden surveillance like I was a stranger in my own marriage. But the truth was, the betrayal had already happened. I just needed proof. I had spent weeks drowning in doubt, second-guessing my instincts, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. But I wasn't. Sarah was lying to me, and I needed to know just how deep that lie went. I did my research carefully. I didn't want anything obvious, nothing that could be discovered by accident. I found small, discrete cameras, motion-activated, high-resolution, with cloud storage so I could access the footage remotely. It took me 2 days to install them, slowly and methodically, making sure they blended seamlessly into the background. The bedroom was my main focus. It made me sick to even think about it, but if something was happening, it would happen there. I placed a tiny camera inside the air vent, angled perfectly to capture the bed. Another went inside the corner of the bookshelf, hidden behind a row of old books. Both were virtually undetectable, their lenses small enough to disappear into the surroundings. I installed another in the living room, tucked inside a decorative plant, and one in the hallway near the front door. I needed to know who was coming and going, when Sarah was home, and when she wasn't. When I was done, I stood in the center of our bedroom. Looking around, my stomach twisted in knots. This had once been the safest place in the world to me, the space where we whispered secrets in the dark, where we had dreamed about our future together. Now, it felt like enemy territory, a crime scene waiting to happen. I almost tore the cameras down right then. A part of me didn't want to do this. I didn't want to see it. I wanted to hold on to the possibility that I was wrong, but I knew I wasn't. That night, I lay in bed next to Sarah, feeling more like a stranger than a husband. She had her back turned to me, her breathing slow and steady. I stared at the ceiling, waiting for sleep that wouldn't come. I had done my part. The cameras were in place. Now, all I had to do was wait. And soon, I would have my answer. I had never felt time move so slowly in my life. Every day after installing the cameras, I went through the motions, pretending nothing had changed. I still kissed Sarah goodbye in the mornings, still ate dinner with her in the evenings, still listened to her excuses about late nights and work stress. But inside, I was a hurricane waiting to tear through everything. I checked the footage every night. At first, there was nothing. Just Sarah alone in the house, scrolling through her phone, pacing the living room, sleeping in our bed like nothing was wrong. Each uneventful clip gave me a sick kind of hope. Maybe I really was losing my mind. Maybe I had made a terrible mistake. Then, on the fourth night, everything changed. I had been at work late, an intentional move to give Sarah space. Space I suspected she was using for something I didn't want to imagine. As soon as I got home, I went straight to my office, locking the door behind me before pulling up the footage. My hands were shaking as I clicked through the timeline. The front door camera showed Sarah arriving home around 6:30 p.m., dressed nicely, her hair styled in a way I hadn't seen in weeks. Then, at 7:15 p.m., another figure appeared at the door. My stomach dropped. A man. Tall. Confident. Moving like he belonged here. Sarah opened the door without hesitation, without even checking who it was. She smiled up at him in a way that twisted my insides. Not the polite, forced smile she gave me lately, the real one. The one she used to give me when we were happy. She pulled him inside. I clicked to the bedroom feed, my vision blurring at the edges, my pulse a deafening roar in my ears. There they were. On our bed. On my bed. Sarah's hands were on him before he even fully stepped inside. Clothes came off quickly, too quickly, like they had been starving for this. Like it wasn't the first time. I couldn't breathe. I watched as my wife, the woman I had built my life with, the woman I had loved without question, gave herself to someone else in the most intimate way possible. Right where I slept. Where we had once made love. I felt something inside me snap. Rage, pure and unfiltered, surged through my body. My hands clenched into fists so tight my nails bit into my skin. My vision turned red. My heart pounded like it was trying to break free from my chest. This was real. It was happening. I wasn't crazy. She had done this. She had thrown everything away for this. I shot up from my chair, knocking it over in the process. My entire body was shaking, adrenaline surging through my veins, demanding action. I wanted to storm in there. I wanted to rip him apart with my bare hands. I wanted Sarah to look me in the eyes and see exactly what she had done. But I forced myself to stop. Not yet. I took deep breaths, struggling to contain the fury that threatened to consume me. Acting now would be too easy for her. If I went in, screamed, and threw punches, she could twist it. She could paint me as the unstable, jealous husband. No, I needed to be smarter. I had the proof. Now, it was time for revenge. Rage still coursed through my veins, but now it had direction. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to fight. I was going to destroy her. Sarah thought she could betray me in my own home. Thought she could lie to my face, share our bed with another man, and walk away untouched? No, she had no idea what was coming. I spent the night awake, running through my plan. I had already gathered the evidence. I had the videos. I had the timestamps. And now, I was going to ruin her life the way she ruined mine. The first step was financial. Sarah and I had joint accounts, shared assets, and, most importantly, a strong credit history that she rarely paid attention to. She left most of the financial responsibilities to me, trusting that I would handle them. And I had, until now. The next morning, before she even opened her eyes, I was on my laptop. I took out a massive personal loan, one that would drain her of every spare penny. Since our names were linked on multiple accounts, the bank approved it with ease. Her debt was now my weapon. Next, I secured my assets. Our house was legally mine. I had bought it before we were married, and thanks to a prenup, she had no real claim to it. I moved all our savings into a private account. She wouldn't see a cent. By the time Sarah woke up, still blissfully unaware of the storm about to hit her, I was ready. I made her coffee like I always did, kissed her cheek like I always did, watched as she smiled at me, as if nothing had happened. It took everything in me not to laugh in her face. She had no idea that within hours, her world would crumble. At lunch, I called my lawyer and started the paperwork. Divorce. Financial separation. Eviction. Sarah wouldn't even get the chance to pack her things. That evening, I played my part perfectly. I greeted her when she got home. I let her go through her routine. She poured herself a glass of wine, scrolled through her phone, probably texting the same man she had desecrated our bed with. I waited until she was comfortable, until she was completely at ease. Then, I struck. I walked into the living room and tossed a manila folder onto the coffee table. Sarah frowned, confused. What's this? I sat across from her, calm, controlled, deadly. Open it. She hesitated. I could see her mind racing, already sensing something was wrong. But she opened the folder anyway. Inside were printed screenshots of the footage from the cameras. Sarah's face drained of color in an instant. I watched as her world collapsed. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She flipped through the pictures, her hands trembling. And then, finally, she looked up at me. Wah. Save it. My voice was ice. I don't want to hear your excuses. I don't care what you have to say. This is over. She blinked rapidly, panicking now. Wait, please, let me explain. There's nothing to explain, Sarah. I leaned back, smiling coldly. You're leaving. Tears welled in her eyes. We can work through this. It was a mistake. You didn't accidentally cheat on me in my own house, Sarah. You made a choice. My voice hardened. And now you're going to face the consequences. I stood up, walked to the door, and pulled a packed suitcase from the hallway. She gasped. What? I packed your things, I said simply. I took care of everything. The accounts? Closed. The house? No longer yours. The loan? In your name. I leaned in, watching as the reality of it all hit her. I own you now, Sarah. She shook her head in disbelief. No, you wouldn't. I laughed, dark and bitter. You thought you could betray me and just walk away? I pointed to the door. Get out. She stared at me, pleading now. I have nowhere to go. Not my problem. I grabbed her phone from the table and smashed it against the floor. She yelped as the pieces scattered. Oops, I said mockingly. Guess you'll have to find a new way to call your little boyfriend. Sarah was crying now. Good. I opened the door, stepping aside. Leave. Now. She didn't move at first, still shaking, still hoping this was all a nightmare. But when she saw the look in my eyes, she knew. I was done. She grabbed the suitcase with trembling hands, stumbling toward the door. Pathetic. As she stepped out, I leaned in one last time and whispered, I hope he was worth it. Then I slammed the door in her face. The moment the door slammed shut behind Sarah, the house fell into an eerie silence. For the first time in years, I was alone. I stood there for a long time, my heart still pounding, my breath shallow. The rage that had fueled me, the fire that had burned so hot inside me just minutes ago, was starting to flicker. It had done its job. I had won. So why didn't I feel better? I walked back into the living room and sat down, staring at the manila folder still lying open on the table. The pictures, evidence of her betrayal, mocked me from the pages. I had seen them over and over again, but the pain never dulled. The images were burned into my brain now, haunting me in a way I hadn't anticipated. Sarah was gone. I had thrown her out. She had lost everything, her home, her security, her carefully built life. I had taken it all from her, just like she had taken everything from me the moment she decided to let another man touch her in our bed. I should have felt satisfaction. I should have felt relief. Instead, all I felt was emptiness. I leaned back, exhaling slowly. The house, our house, suddenly felt too big, like the walls were stretching out into an unfamiliar space. Everything around me was still ours, remnants of a life that no longer existed. Her shoes were still by the door. Her perfume still lingered in the air. Her favorite coffee mug sat in the sink, as if she'd come back any minute to wash it. But she wouldn't. She was never coming back. I ran a hand over my face, exhaustion settling in now that the adrenaline had worn off. I had spent weeks, maybe months, suffocating under the weight of suspicion, anger, and heartbreak. Now that it was over, there was nothing left to feel except numb. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. After 2 rings, my brother picked up. Hey, he said. What's up? I hesitated for a second, then exhaled. I think I need to get out of here. There was a pause on the other end. Then, come over. I've got a bottle of whiskey waiting. I hung up, grabbed my keys, and left without looking back. I didn't know what came next. But for the first time in a long time, I was free. Days passed. Then weeks. The silence in the house never changed, but something inside me did. The anger that had once consumed me began to settle into something colder, something quieter. The initial high of revenge had worn off, and in its place was a hollow space I wasn't sure how to fill. Sarah tried to reach out, of course. Emails, unknown numbers calling my phone, even messages through mutual friends. I ignored every single one. There was nothing left to say. She had made her choices. She had destroyed what we had, and I had made sure she paid for it. I found out through a friend that she had moved in with her sister. She wasn't doing well. She was drowning in the debt I left her with, scrambling to put her life back together. The man she had risked everything for? Gone. He had cut ties with her as soon as things got messy. Typical. A year ago, knowing she was struggling might have made me feel something. Guilt, maybe. A sliver of sadness for the woman I once loved. But now, I felt nothing. I had spent too much time suffering, Too much time letting her choices dictate my pain. I wasn't going to do that anymore. So I started over. I sold the house. There was no way I could keep living in the place where everything had fallen apart. Too many ghosts. Too many memories poisoning the walls. I packed up what little I wanted to keep and left the rest behind. I took time off work and traveled, something Sarah and I had always talked about but never really did. This time, I went alone. It wasn't about running away. It was about reclaiming my life. The first trip was the hardest. Being alone in a new city, surrounded by strangers, with no one waiting for me back home. It made me realize just how much of my identity had been wrapped up in being Sarah's husband. Who was I without her? Who was I now? But with every new place, every new experience, the weight of what happened started to lift. The past began to fade into something distant, something that no longer had control over me. I wasn't a man defined by betrayal anymore. I was just a man, living, moving forward. One night, in a quiet cafe halfway across the world, I looked at my reflection in the window. And for the first time in a long time, I recognized myself again. I wasn't broken. I wasn't angry. I had survived. And I was finally free. Bye-bye.